discuss random stuff, and so one of my recreation episodes, and I guess you can go into more lighthearted topics, like I can talk about gaming stuff or whatever too, but I've tended to avoid that here. I mostly was trying to, I feel like I'm satisfied with a lot of my topics that I kind of went through, and I did some of my logical razors, but you got to think about it like this. What is the objective way that a person would think if they weren't indoctrinated by society or the objective reality of the world? And then look at what people go through when they're younger, even like, you're indoctrinated heavily in youth, and every era of human history and every society and every parent and every, power structure, they want to act like their way of thinking or doing things is absolute, right? Like Rome in the bread and circuses times before it fell, right, they would have thought they were right and they were sure of themselves. So what it shows you is it's not a credible process, right? It's not about the result. Okay, I'm Elon Musk or I'm, whoever, right? It wouldn't matter. It's an unsound process. You can overcompensate for an unsound process, right? You could be in World War II Germany and you could be Oscar Schindler or whatever, right? You could be the exception, or you can overcompensate for a flawed process. But the process is flawed on this basis. That the reason why you support what you support or why you value what you value is not actually based on your choice or will or anything, any sort of standard. It's a myopic form of self-insistence, which is kind of like you happen to be born there, so you value it, or you happen to live there, so you value it, or you happen to be exposed to certain things when you're younger, so now you're defined by those things, right? That's what the absolutists would reject. What you're exposed to, and it would seem like negative, right? It would seem like, oh, you're being pessimist or whatever, some rebellious or something. It's not about that. It's about neutralizing influence that you didn't choose to experience, right? So anything you experience in your youth, even if you think you like it, right, you didn't get a chance to experience everything else in the world, so you don't know if you would have liked that instead if you had experienced it, right? That's how profound your childhood is in terms of whether positive or negative. You should neutralize that influence within this frame of view. And you would say, well, now I'm going to go back to a neutral state when I'm 15 years old or 20 years old or whatever the age is. And now I'll decide for myself using an actual standard or criteria or some objective metric, whatever you decide for yourself what you want to use. But you use it objectively, not just, oh, I happen to grow up doing this thing, so now I like that thing. You might think that's normal or that's fine, but it takes the choice away from you. Is that really what you would have wanted? Is that really what you would have chosen? Or, oh, you just happen to be exposed to it. People don't like to think that way, but would you rather be a slave to that, or would you rather decide for yourself, right? So it'll seem like, oh, you're being negative, like you hate your childhood. You could have had a great childhood. It could have been the best one ever, or a normal one, whatever. But that's not the point, right? It's the nature of the process. If it came about without you choosing it, now it's not credible at all, right? It came about, I won't say by force, but by exposure, like in part by force too, like you're indoctrinated when you're young before you can critically think for yourself. But it's like people let themselves be defined by that too much, right? Like they'd almost take pride in it, like, oh, I love my country, or I love even your family, which you don't choose your family, right? You value all these things, whether positive or negative, that you never even chose, that you didn't have any choice in. So there's something very deceptive about that. You might think that this is the best way to control people, right? Make them associate their identity or their ego with something that they didn't choose, and now they're so deeply within it. This is how society works. This is how contrivance works. Now they're so deeply invested in it that they think they're defending themselves, but they're really just defending that specific contrivance state, right, which they didn't choose. So again, this is how indoctrination in youth works. You put them through certain things when they're younger, right? And now you kind of train them like you would train an animal, almost, the way that reward punishment system and stuff like that. But now when they're old enough to think for themselves, they're not going to think inherently like, oh, I'm a human being and I can do all these things inherently and I can be free and I can live in the woods and I can, there's so many variable lifestyles you can have. That's not actually what happens. What happens is they'll reinforce it. Let me try to think of how I explained this in the past. They'll reinforce it like their state of being as if that's them, right? So if you were living in China right now, you might reinforce that lifestyle. If you were living in World War II Germany, you might reinforce that lifestyle. But the point is, it's not a real thing because you're kind of arguing for something, right? So that's the trap, right? You make somebody exposed to something, right, so much that now when they're older and they can finally choose for themselves, they'll take pride in that and associate with it. Why? Because it's like the cognitive dissonance baseline. They've experienced it and they're so dug into it, so they can't just think, oh, all that time was wasted, or all that was unfounded, or all that was kind of wrong, or not even wrong, but not specifically exclusive to everything else. Like, it's not the one right end all be all. It was just one thing I happened to experience, right? The best way to demonstrate that is like every era of human history, every society always believes they're right and their way of doing things is the best way, right? Just like we might think that now, people think that 500 years from now while ridiculing us and looking at our mistakes, just like we go back in history and look at their mistakes, right? So we can ridicule every era of human history and say, oh, how could they have fallen for this? Or how could they have done this horrible, immoral thing, right? But we don't see it ourselves when we're doing it, or we kind of just accept it and take it. There's like a weird gratification that people get from this too. They'll say like, oh, that's just part of being an adult. Yeah, accepting things that you know are objectively wrong by your standard, by your own subjective standard even, that's part of being an adult. Just going along with an empirical power structure that you didn't choose, right, that's part of being an adult. Like, yeah, if you were an adult in World War II Germany, we saw what adults did there. Like, that's not a good argument, because you want to feel gratified, like, oh, that's the normal thing to do, but you know, it's been normal to do a lot of questionable things, or to allow them to happen in every era of human history. So don't fall for that trap. What I always say, that like things are the way they are because that's the way they should be. No, they are the way they are because some people in the past came from one country to another and massacred other people, and this happened everywhere, but I'm just saying. And then that happened to create a kingdom and a government, and then that's it. So there's no real rhyme or reason to it. It's similar to what I say about God and creation. Like, I had this expression, like, the way, the lack of reason or plan or design for creation, or in this case for like government or society, explains everything that could possibly happen. So it's not a surprise, oh, if a lightning bolt strikes you or something, or if, you know, natural disasters happen, if a meteor strikes, you might think, oh, that's bad luck, but luck is just human-centric and egocentric, right? In reality, it wouldn't be a surprise that any of those things can happen because there's no rhyme or reason to it, right? So when people say it's random, but like random compared to what, right? Compared to something that we would want to revolve around us, like, you know, we want, oh, we were made in God's image, or blah, 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 right? That's what we want, but in reality, you could say not so much that it's random, but it's just cause and effect, right? It just is what it is. It just exists, and different, you know, factors demonstrate. So it's kind of like the lack of any rhyme or reason, or like design, deliberate design, the way that we would think of, would explain everything that could possibly happen. It shouldn't be a surprise because there is no rhyme or reason to it, right? Whereas if there was a rhyme or reason, you could say there's a lot of contradiction then, because, you know, all the species that have existed and gone extinct, and like, how do Christians explain dinosaurs and evolution, and like, it's just a bunch of nonsense. So the other point with that is the simple fact that it's the simple fact that I don't know, you believe things are the way they are because that's the way they should be, or again with the creation versus the, yeah, like the government or empirical authority. It's like, how did it really originate, right? You'll say something good now in retrospect, like, oh, but we need it for this reason or that reason to protect us and keep us safe. But that's not the question, right? This is what objectivity will sometimes do that people don't realize, right? I don't have to be making a specific case for anything. It's more the opposite, right? The burden is on the claim maker. You would have to explain what standard could you possibly have that would lead to this exact state that you're living in, and the answer is there isn't one, right? It would be inconsistent. I always pose that, the longevity process, but it's actually half-mass hedonism. Like, oh, is your goal to live as long as possible? Is that the meaning of life, or is that what your society is based on? Like, to some extent, that seems to be the case, right? Like, okay, people want to live as long as possible, but what does that mean? Then they drink, they smoke, so now you're not credible. They're not trying to just live as long as possible. They want something else from it too, right? Hedonism, different concessions, right? Why else would they do those things? They eat unhealthy. So what you have to understand is the fact that it's not as cut and dry and simple as that, right? So longevity process, and even if you said that, this is where it falls apart completely. Even if you said that was your measure, you want to live as long as possible, you can't enforce that on others or assume the intent of others. Maybe they don't want that. So that's the false duality, closed structure, contrivance state, to say that you're assuming the intent of others, and then you frame it in false duality that, like, oh, you must lack the ability to do this absolute thing that everyone else is doing, like uniformly indoctrinated. Not that it's not absolute. So that point is very profound, but I guess people don't actually have the self-awareness to figure that out. Like, just the fact that there is no credibility, there is no basis. So sometimes people will frame that as like, oh, that means you think you're better or smarter. No, I think I'm just as much of a clown or whatever, not credible human being as anybody else. In other words, I'm not credible, but nobody is credible just because they're carefully curated by the media or even accomplished within a functional zero-sum contrivance state. All that seems nice, but it doesn't really have any empirical credibility or authority. It has a functional basis. You say, oh, well, this person's more productive at this zero-sum task than somebody else. That's measurable, but how can you use that? First of all, it's not a pure meritocracy because there's all these subversive elements that come in between and overextend and specify. But even if it was, who's to say, right? It's always, yeah, it's necessary for that contrivance state, but who says that contrivance state is necessary or best, or, you know, that it should be so uniform. So the point is that, again, the easiest way to control people is you put them in a situation, right? Either you make them think it's their own idea, which is, you know, obviously pretty common, but the other point of it here would be like, not so much you make them think it's their own idea, but you do it to them before they even have any control over it, right? You sort of inflict contrivance upon them. They're victims of contrivance, the non-consensual social contract at birth, right? And then they're old enough to think for themselves. Now somehow they owe something back to it. They owe something back to something that they didn't choose. They, you know, somehow are going to insist upon something that was forced upon them. Even if you want to say overcompensation, that's like a bread and circuses argument. It doesn't qualify the actual basis. It rather overcompensates and satisfies you from questioning it in the first place. So now you understand that right, so again, people are too young to think for themselves. And you hold that over their head and try to use that to, like, think about how desperate that is of contrivance. This shows you the nature of unqualified contrivance right here, right? You would have to do that. You would starve them out, or you would threaten to starve children who are too young to fend for themselves, or even they could fend for themselves at a certain point, but you won't even let them do that because, oh, there'll be rules and laws to prevent that. So that's what society and contrivance depend on. They want you to be dependent on them, right? So they monopolize nature itself. They'll make you pay for water, pay for air, you know, whatever. Now that'll be the next thing. Like, you'll be paying an air tax because, pollution or something. So the point is, they want you to depend on them, and that seems like, oh, look, you lack the ability to do it yourself. But you could easily do it yourself. People have done it throughout history. People do it even now. But you're not allowed to do it. See, that's the false validation. You're not allowed to do it, but then that false thing, oh, see, you depend on us, but you only depend on them because they monopolize everything. They, you know, nature itself is, oh, you can't go anywhere, you can't do anything freely, everything is under scrutiny or trespassing. So that's when you realize laws and so forth are really the arm of corporations in that sense. Like, what are the chances that this society where, oh, we have laws like don't kill each other, that's fine, but like even that gets twisted. Oh, we can go kill people for oil or something, right, in the military. But not even that. It's something deeper, like where, what are the chances that it leads to that monopolized state, right? Like the middleman effect, I call it. No matter what your ideology, your lifestyle, anything, the real rulers of society always win. So like, oh, you can, you know, you're always buying from them, your food, your groceries, your, you know, no matter what you do to some extent, right, you're always paying tribute to the real rulers of the era, right? In this case, corporations and such. You can never escape that, no matter what. You're always going through them. Some monopolized corporation who has, like, you know, it's kind of the reason why social contrivance is such a thing in this era. It's like we resign ourselves and concede to the fact that, oh, this unqualified empirical authority is established and specified. So now it becomes about logo and branding and social reinforcement, right? Like, oh, who's the nicest? Which of these unqualified which of these unqualified forms of authority are best overcompensated for on a social level, such as to not induce cognitive dissonance about the fact that they're unqualified in the first place, right? So you understand that it's very lacking in value there, and it's also, but again, you inflict contrivance upon somebody, and then they associate it with their own identity because they don't want to admit that, all that time was wasted, or they whatever could be wrong. Like, so because it's them and their position that they're in, they couldn't possibly be wrong, right? It's the cognitive dissonance. So you put them in a position, and then they'll defend that position that they're in because they're not actively aware of the fact that you put them there, or because they don't hold that accountable. Right, so you put them in that position, and then they won't reject that and say, no, I'm going to choose them for myself. They're going to act like, oh no, that's what I wanted. I'm going to define my... Because think about, you really have to do this. Everybody should do this, right? It might seem similar to therapy or something like that, which sometimes it can be. Like, the source of some of your fears, like irrational fears, something from when you were younger that you still cling on to, even if it's not valid, right? Some myopic little fragments of some experience that you had. So what this does is you understand that right, it's not so much about negative things that you're looking at here. You're just looking at the general experience. All the things you think you like are only because you experience them. All the things you think you value are only because you were exposed to them. So it's interchangeable. If you hadn't been exposed to that, you wouldn't have liked it. Or if you'd been exposed to something else, you might like that instead. It was that non-choice reaction that you're going to point to. You might use a pretense to say why you like it, but based on that same standard, it's not exclusionary to everything else. So that's the key phrase that I always use with objectivity. It's not that it makes a case or an argument, rather it's the opposite. It exposes that any specific contrivance state that you're in is unqualified, because why is it specifically that as opposed to anything and everything else? So it'll be because of some pretense, right? Like, oh, society, because it's and again, there's two layers of fallacies to this: the assuming of intention, and you assume intent, and then you also specify it. So you would say, like, what makes your society or this way of life or whatever, what makes that specifically valid compared to anything else? Like, compared to other cultures or countries around the world, compared to tribes, compared to history, compared to, any hypothetical example. What makes it specifically different or better than all that? And you would realize, okay, everyone else thinks they're right too. So it's kind of like religion, right? They all believe they're right. So how can, you would have to believe yours is right and everybody else's is wrong. Not that they're all equally arbitrary, as I would say, but that applies to contrivance states and religion too. It's kind of like, so that's why being an atheist is not a term or a position, right? I wouldn't have to argue against a specific religion, like, why aren't you this religion or that religion? I would just have to look at them all the same and say, if you believe in one religion, this is exactly the point I'm talking about with specification and objectivity. You would have to argue why your religion is right and every other one is wrong. Whereas somebody who doesn't believe in any doesn't have to say that, because they're saying, oh, they're all just a psychological need and desire that people have or whatever it is. So they're all the same, right? They're all equally arbitrary, versus singling one out and trying to argue for that. So that's why the burden is on the claim maker. Whereas if you're neutral, you're not believing in any, so you don't have to defend anything. But that's like the false inherent aspect, is that you get, like, you have to argue against it, not that you have to argue for it. Kind of preconceived non-thought that necessary, the fact that, it's so obvious it goes without saying, but actually it's the opposite. It's that it's so unqualified that it requires you not to think about it, because any amount of thought would invalidate it, and expose it. So the other point is the simple fact that again, the unqualified basis that you would have to say why specifically. So yeah, let's look at the assume intent and then the specify aspect. So you assume intent to say, okay, the basis of your society and lifestyle now is the fact that it's about progress and technology and, some zero-sum convenience and things like that. But you're assuming the intent. Who says that that's what somebody wants? Maybe somebody would be content being a minimalist and having as little as possible, but oh no, you still have to feed into this, consumerism sort of society. And oh, you can be a part of it too, and oh, you can, exploit people with it. But none of that validates it, or in the origin, like, you're assuming that that's what everybody wants, and you might think, oh, it's a zero-sum thing, like, oh, it's better technology is better, and better progress is better, but there's no actual basis to that, because, right, what if you don't want that? What if you don't need that? What if you're content without it, right? So you can't force that on somebody. And then the other point is the fact of, then you specify, you'll say, okay, even if you assume that intent, now you say it's based on merit or something, functionalism is zero-sum process, but it's not, because no matter what the standard is, you can always hold it accountable, and it could be more of the same. Oh, it's a certain level of efficiency, but it could be even more efficient, and then it could be even more and more. So if you hold it truly fully accountable, you'll never be satisfied, and there's never a basis to specify and say, oh, this validates this unqualified empirical authority structure or whatever it is, right, this specific thing. Based on what, though, right? Based on what? So you're conceding it's not qualified, but you defer to it anyway, because, like, oh, it's the best you got, that kind of thing, but there's no actual credibility behind it, right? It is completely arbitrary, so you can make, like, a half-functionalist argument, but that kind of folds on itself when you realize the fact that, right, like, oh, it's for some zero-sum functionalism, but again, assuming that intent for, like, again, it'll always be deferential to some authority in that way. So, for example, right, like, you could argue for the measure, but then you say, why this specific society or this specific government or this specific power structure or this specific authority figure? There's no way to actually reconcile that. It's always interchangeable and arbitrary. You just kind of settle for it because it's already established and preconceived. But if you return to a neutral base state, now you can decide for yourself, and you say, it's all the same, right? It's not that it's bad, or you're even saying an alternative. You're just simply saying, it's the same process, right? It's the same process as all of human history, right? Every society thought it was right and unquestionable. Everybody now thinks the same thing. So it's not actually based on anything. It's just reinforcing what's already there, uncritically, often using a pretense, like, oh, in the name of progress or in the name of functionalism or whatever. But it's not actually consistent. Or again, how efficient would you have to be than to exclude everything else? But this is how the absolutist invalidates contrivance. They would say, they would take that seriously and say, okay, the basis is meritocracy. So if I do my meritocracy better than yours, then it subverts your authority, and then I'll take your place, or I'll remove the need for it, right? So, it's about doing this efficiently, but it's not fully about that, right? There's like a social subversive halfway layer, like, oh, you can do it efficiently, but if you do it too efficiently, that's bad too, because everything has to be controlled and overextended by empirical authority and corporations and whatever. So, oh, you want to do it efficiently in pretense, in half-mast, but then if you do it too much, like, oh, now we don't need the corporation, now we can just we can self-govern, we can be on our own in the wild, right? We can do whatever we want. So, oh no, but you can't do that. So there's a halfway. It uses, again, in that example, like, oh, meritocracy or functionalism as a pretense, but then if you go too far with it, oh no, that's not good, that's a bad thing, right? So there's a second layer to it where something is more important, right, that you always have to be controlled no matter what. Like who would you have to be to not be a part of society or whatever? And you would say, like, oh, if you're Elon Musk, and sure, you get certain privileges or whatever, whoever it might be, somebody very rich, but you still are subject to a lot of that kind of, even though, again, based on your wealth, you can bypass and subvert, but the intentionality is you're still subject to contrivance, right? There's never a point like, okay, I can just go off and buy my own island and just live there, but you'll still be paying taxes, or you'll never be able to escape it, right? So, and then the other point is the fact that what was I saying? The unqualified. I really need something like that kind of retraces like live subtitles as I'm saying it, so that I can like read back, because I kind of go off on different areas very dynamically like that. So just kind of like a backlog of what I'm saying would be kind of good. But I don't know. It's basically, you can't assume the intent. You're arguing for something specific, and it's kind of unqualified, because there's always going to be inconsistency, or again, it emboldens the absolutist. Like, okay, the goal of the structure and the inhibition that you have to justify why you're inhibiting the inherent ability of human beings. Like, there are no rights, only restrictions, my expression. So I say, that's why I'm doing a lot of these, to sort of preserve these expressions and logical razors as mine, because these are things I said in the past, and so a lot of them YouTube titles should be copyrighted, which I don't know if they actually are, but like, at least you'll see that I had it there. But then they'll say, oh, you could have changed the title or something stupid. But basically, whatever. I'm saying it in the video too, so maybe you can change that. But no, it's a situation where, you know what I'm saying, like, whatever the pretense is to justify unqualified empirical authority to inhibit your inherent nature and freedom that you can potentially have, right, that people have inherently, it's always unqualified, because it's based on some pretense, like, oh, it's in the name of such and such, but then that could always be done better. So if you do it better and fully, then you would remove the need for it. So there's something in between. Oh, but that's not the goal, right? Like, okay, let's all just be so efficient that we can, or minimalistic or whatever, that we can just go live out in the woods and self-govern. Now we don't need government, right? And oh, then they would call it a cult or something, but, like a tribe or some religious pretense you need. Like, oh, there you go. Now you don't need society anymore. And if everybody thought like that, then there might not be any society anymore. So you understand that there's a second incentive behind it, and that incentive is... to keep that sort of power structure in place regardless of anything. You could be the most efficient person ever, but you're still held back. It's this middle ground where often social contrivances used there, like, if it was pure merit and ability, then you could easily knock out the current power structure. You would say, okay, I do this more efficiently, therefore I'm going to kick out people who, but that's why I talk about rule by omission protocol, which I call how the masses, or how the mediocre rule the masses, right, through subversive elements, whether it be marketing or whether social contrivance or cult of personality and stuff. It's how you can create something that isn't based purely on merit, and so the mediocre rule over the masses like that.